At sunrise, the Colosseum was already awake. Its massive arches caught the first pale streaks of light, while yesterday's blood still clung to the stone like a shadow that refused to fade. Beneath the stands, vendors shouted over one another, hawking baskets of olives and watered wine to a crowd that hadn't even taken their seats yet. Beyond the iron gates, handlers shoved half-starved predators into place. Lions with ribs showing through their fur, elephants stamping in frustration, panthers clawing at the bars. From the tunnels came the sharp clang of steel. Not training swings, tests, the final checks of the blades that would decide who lived and who died. And over it all, a low hum began to rise. Thousands of voices blending into a roar, tens of thousands of Romans pouring in, hungry for the thing their empire perfected better than anyone. Death, dressed up as entertainment, because the Roman arena wasn't just a sport. It was a system, a machine, a place where cruelty wasn't an accident. It was the point. Emperors staged naval battles in flooded amphitheaters. They starved wild animals to heighten the suspense. They forced prisoners to act out myths that ended in real blood. None of it was random. It was policy. Control disguised as spectacle. The cheering crowds weren't innocent either. Every shout from the stands was a pledge of loyalty. A declaration that Rome's power was worth any price. And today, we're stepping straight into that shadow. These are the most brutal, most inhumane arena acts that went too far, even for Rome. From blood-soaked funeral rites to executions disguised as theater. We'll uncover how an empire built its glory on turning suffering into applause. So take your seat. The gates are creaking open. The first gladiatorial combat in Rome didn't begin with golden fanfare or emperors in royal purple. It began at a funeral. In 264 BC, the sons of Decimus Junius Brutus Sceva decided not to honor their father with statues or prayers, but with blood. They armed 3 pairs of slaves and forced them to fight to the death in the Forum, a cattle market thick with the smell of dung, sweat, and smoke. This wasn't entertainment. It was duty, a munus, an obligation owed to the dead. The tradition reached far beyond Rome. In Campania, warriors were once slain at graves to appease restless spirits. Over time, the ritual shifted, from killing as sacrifice to killing as combat. The dead no longer demanded random victims, but duels between chosen men. The Samnites, Rome's old enemies, held such contests often, and Rome's elite quickly adopted the idea. Burying a man with treasures showed wealth. Burying him with blood proved power. But funerals were only the beginning. By the 3rd century BC, Rome's leaders saw how these fights could serve a new purpose: politics. Religious festivals once meant to honor Jupiter began featuring gladiatorial duels. The Senate called it piety, but everyone knew better. These were state-sponsored killings designed to keep the people loyal. Even the armor told a story. Early fighters wore the styles of conquered foes. The Samnite with his heavy shield, the Thracian with his curved blade, the Gaul with his broadsword. Watching them bleed was watching Rome's victories replayed, slash after slash. Death became propaganda. And as the blood spilled, the venues grew. Temporary wooden stands gave way to permanent amphitheaters. Temples to violence where thousands gathered under the sun. The games no longer belonged to grieving families. They belonged to the state. Each drop of blood whispered the same message. Rome ruled everything. Men, armies, even death itself. No one could have guessed how far it would go. What began as ritual sacrifice evolved into theater. Duty became obsession. Rome had discovered a new kind of power. Not just over the living, but over the meaning of dying. And once that door was opened, it never closed again. The crowd's roar wasn't only for men. Sometimes it thundered for beasts, dragged from the farthest edges of the known world. Lions from North Africa, leopards from the Caucasus, crocodiles from the Nile, even giraffes hauled across endless deserts. They weren't paraded as wonders of nature. They were condemned as prey in a carnival of slaughter. The Romans called these shows venations, hunts. But they weren't hunts for survival. They were rituals of domination. Proof that the empire could trap the wild, chain it, and destroy it just to prove a point. Julius Caesar set the tone back in 46 BC. He brought a giraffe to Rome, the first one Europe had ever seen. They called it a camelopard, half camel, half leopard, because Rome didn't even have a word for it. But the creature wasn't admired. It was thrown into the arena and torn apart before a cheering crowd. The message was crystal clear. If Rome could capture the strangest beasts alive, then nothing on earth was beyond its reach. The bloodletting only grew worse. When the Colosseum opened in 80 AD, Emperor Titus reportedly oversaw the deaths of more than 9,000 animals during a single festival. Archaeologists have found bones marked with cuts, signs that lions and bears were deliberately starved before their deaths to make sure the spectacle was fast, brutal, and bloody. Even elephants, once the terror of Rome's legions under Hannibal, were herded into the arena and butchered for entertainment. Behind the scenes, the logistics were almost as shocking as the shows themselves. Exotic animals had to be captured, dragged across deserts, and kept barely alive long enough to die for the crowd's amusement. Caravans hauled cages over scorching sands. Ships carried them down the Nile. Handlers risked their lives every step of the way just to deliver living trophies to Rome. Seeing a panther in the wild was terrifying enough, but watching one burst from a cage in front of 50,000 screaming spectators, that was power made visible. Every creature that fell on that sand became a symbol, a living souvenir of conquest. Some emperors turned these hunts into their own personal stage. None more than Commodus, Rome's most flamboyant showman. He strutted into the arena dressed as Hercules, muscles gleaming, bow in hand, and hunted animals that had been crippled beforehand. To the crowd, he wanted to look like a god among beasts, but everyone could see the truth. He was just a fragile man with too much power and a desperate need for attention. The hunts were rigged from the start. Animals were chained, maimed, or half-starved to guarantee the emperor's victory. It wasn't courage, it was control. Control over life, over spectacle, and over fear. And the people cheered. Not out of love, but out of fear, because silence in the Colosseum could be dangerous. But behind the cheers was another tragedy, one the Romans didn't notice, or didn't care to. Ancient writers like Pliny the Elder warned that whole species were vanishing from their native lands after decades of Roman slaughter. Lions, leopards, even elephants were driven toward extinction just to feed the empire's appetite for blood. The Colosseum wasn't only a theater of death, it was an ecological disaster. But extinction didn't matter to Rome. What mattered was the illusion that nature itself could be captured, starved, and destroyed for pleasure. Every carcass on that arena floor was another message carved into the empire's story. Proof that Rome ruled not just nations, but the very natural world itself. The crowd believed they were watching glory and courage, but what they were really seeing was humanity at its most dangerous. When cruelty becomes entertainment, and domination feels divine. When you picture a gladiator, maybe you imagine two evenly matched warriors, steel clashing, crowds on their feet, honor on the line. But the truth? It was far darker. Rome didn't thrive on fair fights. It thrived on imbalance. Contests designed for cruelty, for tension, for domination. They built bizarre weapons, twisted matchups, and invented new ways to make pain feel like entertainment. Many of those sent into the arena weren't fighters at all. They were prisoners, slaves, condemned criminals, shoved into the sand dressed like fools, handed wooden swords, and told to face trained killers. The crowd roared with laughter as the doomed stumbled and fell. Public execution disguised as sport. Even the weapons told stories. The retiarius, armed with a fisherman's net and trident, faced the secutor, whose smooth, rounded helmet was designed to deflect that net. It wasn't about skill, it was suspense. A living puzzle. Would the net entangle the hunter, or would the sword break through first? Romans devoured that tension, even when the match was as scripted as a stage play. But as time went on, the numbers got worse. More brutal, more grotesque. One man might be thrown against 3 or 10. Other days, entire squads fought like miniature armies, turning the sand into a swamp of blood, splintered shields, and mangled bodies. And when the crowd got bored, Rome always got creative. Female gladiators appeared, gladiatrices. They stepped onto the sand in the 1st century AD. Writers like Juvenal mocked them, but they were real. Women fighting dwarfs, beasts, even each other. Their presence blurred the lines of gender and decency, but the message was the same. In Rome, no one was beyond exploitation. Even the helmets became instruments of torment. Some were designed to narrow vision or muffle sound, forcing fighters to stumble half-blind while the audience laughed. Others were so heavy that lifting one's head became its own kind of battle. Armor wasn't always protection. Sometimes it was punishment, and then came the propaganda plays. If this glimpse into Rome's dark beginnings caught your attention, don't go anywhere. There's so much more buried beneath the sand. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because the story's about to get a lot darker. Gladiators dressed as barbarians, forced to reenact Rome's victories and lose, again and again. Their deaths reminded everyone that the Empire always won. Every mismatch, every exotic twist, every gender-bending stunt, all of it was deliberate. A way to keep the crowds shocked, obedient, and craving more. Because the Colosseum never repeated itself. It always pushed the line, inventing new cruelties, always chasing the next thrill. By midday, when the morning's duels had already soaked the sand and the crowd began to fidget, the arena shifted gears, the swords disappeared, the theater began, and death took center stage. By midday, the sun hung heavy over the Colosseum, and the sand already gleamed red. The crowd buzzed, restless. The morning's duels were done. It was time for something darker. Now came the real spectacle, the damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. For the condemned, this wasn't a trial. It was a performance, a play written by the Empire, where every ending was the same. Criminals, deserters, rebellious slaves, prisoners of war, all became unwilling actors in a bloody drama. Their roles, to die, creatively. Each execution matched the crime. Thieves were torn apart by wolves. Arsonists were burned alive. Traitors, thrown to lions. Every scene was a morality tale written in real blood, and the scale of it all was staggering. During Emperor Trajan's celebration after his Dacian victory, thousands of captives were slaughtered over 103 relentless days. This wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Each death staged to shock, to keep the audience hooked until the next horror arrived. Animals were the stars of this nightmare. Lions were starved for days to make them frenzied. Bears were chained and goaded until they lunged in rage. Even leopards, prized and beautiful, were unleashed just to die. The uncertainty. Would the beast strike fast or play with its prey? That's what kept the crowd screaming. Sometimes the cruelty came dressed up as legend. Prisoners were forced to act out myths. Orpheus torn apart by beasts. Prometheus chained as vultures circled. These weren't stories anymore. They were blood-soaked reenactments. The stage was sand. The costumes were real flesh, and the applause, deafening. Death in Rome wasn't just death. It was theater. Grotesque, mocking theater. For the condemned, dying wasn't enough. They had to perform their own execution. Act out Rome's myths with their own bodies. Every gasp, every scream, part of the show. And the cruelty only deepened. Crucifixions were staged right there in the arena. Men and women nailed to crosses while vendors sold wine and children played nearby. Fire joined the act too. Prisoners wrapped in pitch-soaked shirts were set ablaze, human torches twisting in agony as the smoke rose into the Roman sky. Tertullian called them living torches. These weren't punishments anymore. They were propaganda. Warnings carved into living flesh. Defy Rome and you'll die, slowly, publicly, and for applause. Not everyone could stomach it. Seneca, the philosopher, said the midday executions hardened men's hearts, that each show made them crueler, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of a crowd that came not for justice, but for pleasure. If you thought Rome's bloodlust ended on dry land, think again, because sometimes they brought the sea to the city. The Colosseum, yes, that same stone giant, could actually be flooded. Engineers designed hidden channels and aqueducts that turned the arena into a shallow lake. And what happened next was pure Roman madness. They called it the naumachia, mock naval battles fought with real ships, real water, and real men who usually didn't come back. Thousands of slaves and prisoners were shoved into those wooden boats, armed with rusted swords and fake armor that wouldn't even float. They were ordered to fight to the death, while spectators cheered from marble seats, sipping wine like it was a stage play. Before the battle began, the doomed fighters saluted the emperor. Av Caesar! Moritur te salutant. Hail Caesar. Those who are about to die salute you. It wasn't poetry. It was a farewell. The gates would lift, and chaos would erupt. Oars clashing, water churning, men screaming as ships rammed into each other. The emperor would sit high above it all, watching like a god as the sea turned red. For Rome, it wasn't just about violence. It was about power. If the empire could conquer nature itself, flood a desert of sand and fill it with ships, what couldn't Rome do? But even as the spectacle grew grander, the cruelty became more creative. The myths they'd once read about in scrolls were brought to life with horrifying realism. You didn't just hear the story of Icarus. You saw a man launched into the air on hidden wires, wings strapped to his back, plummeting to his death as the crowd gasped. You didn't imagine Prometheus chained to a rock. You watched a prisoner tied down while birds tore at him. The Romans called it mythic execution. But it was really just theater dressed up as religion. Even the staging was elaborate. Hidden elevators lifted entire forests, animals, or temples out of the ground. Imagine sitting in the stands as the floor split open. And suddenly, a jungle emerged, lions pacing through palm trees, and a man standing terrified in the center. Every performance had the same ending: death. But Rome didn't see it as cruelty. They called it entertainment. To them, the arena wasn't a place of horror. It was a reflection of empire. Organized, majestic, merciless. A place where myth, machinery, and mortality met. The Colosseum wasn't built for sport. It was built for control. Every cheer, every drop of blood, every dying scream served a purpose. The games reminded the people who ruled, and who obeyed. For the emperors, the arena was their loudest stage. It was where they could prove they were powerful, generous, even divine. Feed the people, entertain them, and they'd forget about politics, poverty, and war. Bread and circuses, they called it. Give them food, give them a show, keep them quiet. But sometimes, the show went too far. Caligula, infamous for his madness, once ran out of prisoners mid-show. So, he pointed to the crowd and ordered random spectators to be dragged down and killed instead. They came to watch death, and ended up part of it. Nero turned the arena into his own stage. He played the hero, the poet, even the god. Prisoners were forced to act in his twisted plays, and die exactly as the script demanded. He called it art. Rome called it insanity. And then there was Commodus, the emperor who thought he was Hercules. He stepped into the arena himself, dressed in lion skins, wielding a club. He killed hundreds of animals that had been maimed or chained so he couldn't lose. The crowd cheered, not from admiration, but fear. Silence could get you killed. The arena didn't just break bodies, it bent minds. Philosophers like Seneca begged people to stop watching. He said it made men cruel, numb, and hollow. But no one listened. By then, violence was part of daily life. Vendors sold roasted nuts while men were torn apart. Children played games imitating gladiators. Blood had become normal. Even emperors who weren't monsters, like Trajan, couldn't resist it. He celebrated victory with 103 days of games. Thousands of people died just to mark his triumph. Rome called it glory. History calls it obsession. But power always has a price. Caligula and Commodus both died violently, murdered by the very people who once cheered their names. The arena that built their fame also revealed their madness. And slowly, Rome began to rot from the inside. Spectacle replaced discipline. Applause replaced virtue. An empire that once conquered the world was now addicted to its own show. Not every Roman cheered. Even at the height of the empire, a few voices whispered that something was deeply wrong. Philosophers, poets, and early Christians began to see what the crowd refused to. That the arena wasn't entertainment. It was rot dressed in marble. Seneca wrote that watching men die didn't teach courage. It hardened the soul. Each execution, he said, stripped away compassion until cruelty felt normal. Cicero, long before him, warned that mercy was the true mark of civilization. But even he knew that to rule Rome, you had to feed the mob. The beast always wanted blood. For the early Christians, the arena became both a place of horror and faith. They refused to worship the emperor, refused to bend. So Rome threw them to the lions and called it justice. Crowds roared as believers met their deaths with prayer on their lips. And slowly, their courage began to plant a new kind of seed, one that outlived the empire itself. But while faith was rising, Rome was crumbling. The games that once showed strength began to show desperation. Emperors bankrupted themselves trying to outshine the ones before them. Bigger shows, wilder beasts, more bodies. The more Rome decayed, the louder the crowd demanded distraction. Poets mocked the people's hunger for bread and circuses. Cheap food, free entertainment, anything to forget how far they'd fallen. The discipline that built the Republic had turned into the addiction that destroyed it. By the 5th century, the arenas stood nearly silent. The roar of 50,000 voices was gone, replaced by the wind sighing through cracked stone. The Colosseum, once drenched in blood, became a ruin, scarred, hollow, yet somehow still proud. And standing there today, it's easy to admire it. The symmetry, the scale, the sheer ambition of it all. But the real story isn't carved in the stone. It's buried in the sand. A story of cruelty rehearsed until it felt normal. Of a people who mistook brutality for greatness. The games taught Rome that power was eternal, that it could control nature, men, even death. But in the end, that same obsession destroyed it. A civilization that glorifies violence always collapses beneath its own applause. So now the question turns to us. What do we cheer for? What do we find entertaining? Because history doesn't just repeat itself. It watches. The Colosseum may be quiet now, but its echoes still breathe through the stones. So, what do we really take from all this? Rome's arenas may stand silent now, but the echoes haven't faded. They still whisper through time, reminding us that power built on cruelty can never last. Forever, an empire that teaches its people to cheer for suffering will one day find no one left to cheer at all. Every stone of the Colosseum still hums with the same question. How far will we go just to be entertained? The blood has long turned to dust, but the warning remains, etched into history itself. If this story made you think, or maybe made you feel something, don't let it end here. Tap that like button. It helps this story reach more curious minds. Drop your thoughts below. Which part of Rome's arena struck you the most? And if you want more deep dives into the darker corners of history, subscribe so you never miss our next journey into the past. Until next time, take care of your heart, your humanity, and the stories we choose to tell. Because history doesn't just live in ruins, it lives in us.